The scar on my collarbone was still pink. Even 3 months later, every time I reached up to button my cardigan, my fingers found that raised pale line and I had to stop for a moment and breathe. My doctor said it would fade. Maybe it would, but I don't think I'll ever stop finding it with my fingers. My name is not important. What happened to me is, I turned 64 in March. I live in a house I have owned for 22 years, in a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio, where the maple tree in my front yard turns a color in October that I have never been able to describe to anyone. Not quite red, not quite orange, something in between that only lasts about 10 days before the wind takes it. Every year I sit on my porch with a cup of tea and watch it happen. Every year it feels like something being given and taken away at the same time. I taught middle school English for 31 years. I retired at 62 with a modest pension, a joint savings account I had been building since my husband passed in 2019, and a son I believed with everything in me was a good man. I need you to understand that last part, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand how much I loved my son, how proud I was of him, how, even when things got difficult, I told myself he was going through something, that he would find his way back, that the boy who used to fall asleep on my lap during thunderstorms was still in there somewhere. His name doesn't matter either. I'll call him my son. His wife I will call Renata. I never warmed to Renata. I want to be honest about that, because I spent a long time wondering if my instincts about her had colored everything that came after. She was beautiful in a way that seemed engineered, always put together, always smiling exactly the right amount. She called me by my first name from the very first meeting, before I had invited her to. A small thing. I told myself it was a small thing. They married 4 years ago. I gave them $20,000 as a wedding gift. My son had asked me for it the week before the wedding, said it was to cover some unexpected catering costs. I wrote the check without hesitating. That was the first time. I did not know then that there would be more times, that each time would be a little larger, a little easier for me to say yes to. They moved into a house about 12 minutes from mine. I thought that was wonderful. I thought it meant Sunday dinners and holidays together, and being close enough to be useful. I brought them meals when Renata said she was too tired to cook. I watched their dog when they went on trips. I lent my son my car for 3 weeks when his transmission failed, and he said he couldn't afford the repair. I was happy to do it. I want to be clear about that. I was not keeping score. I was just being his mother. The financial requests became regular somewhere around the 2nd year of their marriage. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. My son always had a reason. Renata's car insurance had gone up. The furnace needed servicing. He had a gap between paychecks because of a billing delay at work. The reasons were always specific enough to sound real. I always said yes. I was not a wealthy woman, but I had saved carefully my whole life. The way my own mother had taught me a little put away every month, no matter what. By the time I retired, I had a little over $90,000 in savings, plus my pension and my husband's small life insurance payout. Enough to live comfortably, enough to be generous without being reckless. Or so I believed. The account I used most regularly was a joint savings account I had set up years ago, originally with my husband, and after he passed, I had added my son as a secondary holder, so he could help me manage things if I ever had a health emergency. He had never needed to use that access. It was meant to be a safeguard. I did not look at my statements very carefully. This is the thing I am most ashamed of, and I will say it plainly. I got my statements by mail, and I would glance at the balance and put them in a folder. I trusted that the number was roughly what I expected it to be. I had no reason to check closely. I was not a suspicious person. I became a suspicious person on a Tuesday afternoon in September, when I needed to transfer money to cover my property tax payment, and I called the bank to confirm the amount in my account. The number the representative read to me was not the number I expected. It was $41,000 less. I asked her to repeat it. She did. I asked if there had been some kind of error. She said she would need me to come into the branch if I wanted to review the transaction history in detail. I said I would be there in 20 minutes. I sat in my car in the driveway for a while first. I remember the sound of the neighbor's wind chimes. I remember a cloud moving across the sun. I remember thinking, there has to be an explanation. There is always an explanation. At the bank, a young woman named Patricia sat across from me and pulled up my account on her screen, and she turned it toward me. And I looked at the transaction history, and I felt the floor shift under my chair. Withdrawals. Transfers. Over an 18-month period. Some as small as $400. Some as large as $3,000. 37 transactions in total. Every one of them initiated from my son's access. From devices and locations I didn't recognize. My son's phone. My son's laptop. A coffee shop 12 minutes from their house. None of them were emergencies. None of them were things he had asked me about. I sat very still for a long time. Patricia brought me a paper cup of water and I held it in both hands. I did not cry in the bank. I waited until I was back in my car. I want to tell you something about that drive home because I think it matters. I was not angry yet. What I felt, more than anything, was a specific kind of grief, the grief of realizing that a story you have told yourself about your own life is not true. The story I had told myself was that my son would never. That whatever mistakes he made, whatever he struggled with, he would never take from me without asking. That the foundation of trust between us was solid. I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea I did not drink, and I looked at the Thomas guide my husband had kept on the bookshelf for 30 years, which I could never bring myself to throw away, and I said to the empty room, "What do I do now?" I did not call my son that night, or the next day. I needed to think. What I did was call my friend Carolyn, who has been my closest friend since we were both new teachers in the same district in 1987. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love about her most. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You need to talk to someone at the bank about your options, and you need to talk to your son, and you need to do it in that order." I went back to the bank the next morning and spoke to a fraud specialist. He explained my options. He said that because my son was a listed secondary account holder, what had occurred existed in a gray area legally, but that if I wanted to pursue it, I should document everything and consult an attorney. He also said, very gently, that I should consider removing my son's access to the account immediately. I did that. I sat right there in the chair in his office, and I had my son's access removed. Then I drove home and I called my son. He answered on the second ring. He sounded normal. He asked how I was. I said I was fine. I said I needed to see him. He said, "Sure. That week? Maybe Thursday?" I said no. I said tonight. There was a pause. Then he said, "Okay." They arrived at 7. Renata came with him, which I had expected. She was wearing a pale green blouse, and her hair was down. She smiled at me when she came through the door. The smile did not reach her eyes. We sat at the kitchen table. I had the bank statements printed out. I had put them in a manila folder. I placed the folder on the table in front of me, and I looked at my son, and I said, quietly and carefully, "I need to ask you about my savings account." What I saw on his face in that moment is something I have thought about many times since. It was not surprise. It was something more complicated than surprise. It was the face of someone who has been waiting for a conversation and had decided, some time ago, how they would handle it when it came. He looked at Renata before he looked at me. She spoke first. She said we had been struggling. She said the cost of living had gone up. She said that they had intended to pay it back. She said these things in a calm, reasonable voice, as if she were explaining a minor accounting oversight. I looked at my son and I said, "Did you know about this?" He said, "We both decided." I said, "Without asking me." He said, "We didn't think you would miss it." I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I have sat with it many times. We didn't think you would miss it. Not. We were wrong. Not. We're sorry. We didn't think you would miss it. As if the question were not whether it was right, but whether I would notice. I said, $41,000, and you didn't think I would miss it. Renata said my name in a tone that suggested I was the one being unreasonable. I said, "I want it back. I want a plan, in writing, for how and when it will be repaid. And I want you to understand that what you did has a legal name." That was when the temperature in the room changed. My son stood up. He said I was being dramatic. He said that family didn't press charges over misunderstandings. He said that I had always made him feel like a financial burden, which was so far from the truth that for a moment I couldn't find any words at all. I said, "Sit down, please. Let's talk about this calmly." Renata said something to my son in a low voice. I didn't catch all of it. I caught the words she's not going to. And let her try. My son sat back down. He leaned across the table and he said, in a voice I did not recognize, You should be grateful we checked in on you as much as we did. You're alone in this house. You could fall, and nobody would know for days. I felt cold when he said that. Not frightened, exactly, but cold. I said, I think it's time for you both to leave. Renata picked up her purse. She said, on her way to the door, Don't expect an apology. You got the money's worth in peace of mind. My son followed her. At the door he turned back. I thought, for just a moment, that he was going to say something real, that he was going to look at me the way he used to when he was small and had done something wrong and knew it. He said, Don't call us. The door closed. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. Everything was completely ordinary, and nothing was the same. I called Carolyn. I told her what had happened. She said she was coming over. I told her she didn't need to. She came anyway, and she sat with me until almost midnight, and we didn't talk about my son most of that time. We talked about other things. We watched half of a movie neither of us was really watching. Her being there was enough. The next morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Judith, and she had been in practice for over 30 years. And she had the kind of steadiness that I found very reassuring. I brought her the printed statements. I brought the records of every loan, every gift, every cash transfer I could document, going back 4 years. I told her everything. She said I had a case. She said the secondary account access had been used in a way that went beyond its intended purpose, and that documented pattern of unauthorized withdrawal, combined with evidence that I had not approved many of these transactions, could support a civil claim and potentially a criminal referral. She said, Do you want to pursue this? I thought about the maple tree in October. I thought about my husband's hands, how they looked when he taught me to drive a stick shift on an empty parking lot when we were 26. I thought about the boy who used to put his head in my lap during thunderstorms. I said, yes. What followed was several months of documentation, legal correspondence, and waiting. There was a point. Around the second month, when my son called me. I was in the garden. I saw his name on the screen. I answered. He said, Mom. I said, yes. He said, this has gone too far. I said, I agree. He said, can't we just settle this between us? Can't we just work something out without all of this? I said, we had the chance to do that at my kitchen table. You told me not to call you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she's pregnant. I sat down on the garden bench. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I have not always been honest about it. Even with myself, I felt something crack open. I felt the pull of it, the possibility of stepping back, of letting this go, of being the grandmother of that child, of having something whole again. I sat with that feeling for about 30 seconds. Then I said, I hope you'll both be good parents. I really do. But that doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't change what I have to do. He hung up. The case went to civil court 8 months after I first walked into the bank and saw those numbers on the screen. My attorney and I had built a thorough record. Bank records showing the unauthorized withdrawals, metadata from the transactions showing they had been initiated from my son's devices, text messages, which I had kept, all of them, without fully understanding at the time why I could not bring myself to delete them, showing conversations where my son acknowledged taking the money and where Renata discussed strategy about whether I would find out. My son's attorney argued that the account was jointly held and that there was an implicit family understanding that the funds were available to him. He argued that gifts and loans within families are murky territory and should not be treated as criminal theft. He was not without a point, legally speaking, and I knew that going in. My attorney argued that implicit permission is not actual permission, that I had a documented, consistent pattern of being asked for money and agreeing, which proved that my son knew he needed to ask, that the unauthorized use of the account access, never disclosed to me, never approved by me, in amounts deliberately kept below levels that would trigger automatic bank alerts, demonstrated not a family misunderstanding but a deliberate and systematic plan. The judge agreed with my attorney. My son was ordered to repay the full $41,000 in structured payments with interest. He was placed on a civil judgment that would follow him until the debt was satisfied. There was no criminal conviction. The gray area of the joint account made that complicated, but the civil judgment was real, and it was enforceable, and it was documented. Renata was not named in the judgment because the account access had been in my son's name alone, but the text messages were read into the record. I watched her face while her own words were read aloud in that courtroom, and I will not describe what I saw there, because I think it speaks for itself. After the judgment was read, my son looked at me across the courtroom. I thought again about the boy in the thunderstorm. I thought about how love does not disappear because someone hurts you. I thought about how you can grieve someone who is still alive and still choosing, every day, to be the person they have chosen to be. He did not speak to me. He walked out with Renata, and she was already on her phone before they reached the door. I sat in that courtroom for a while after they left. My attorney sat next to me. She said, "How are you feeling?" I said I wasn't sure yet. I'm still not sure, if I am being honest with you. That is not the clean ending that part of me wanted. But I have come to believe that clean endings are mostly something we put in stories so we can bear them. The real endings are messier. They sit with you. They change shape over time. What I know is this. I know that I did not let what happened to me go unnamed. I know that I sat in a bank chair and in an attorney's office and in a courtroom, and I told the truth, clearly, even when it cost me something I did not want to lose. I know that I kept the text messages, and I kept the statements, and I kept my composure, and I kept going. I know that my pension and what remains of my savings are mine again, secured and protected in accounts with no secondary holders. I know that Carolyn still comes over on Thursday evenings, and we drink tea, and sometimes we watch the movie, and sometimes we don't. I know that my son's first payment arrived in the mail on a Wednesday in April. There was no note inside, just the check. The amount was exactly what was required. I deposited it, and I went home, and I sat on my porch, and I watched the maple tree, and I thought about what my husband used to say about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. He said they were not the same thing. He said you could grant one without the other. He said forgiveness is something you do for yourself so the wound doesn't fester. Reconciliation is something that takes two people who both want the same thing. I think I understand that now in a way I didn't when he first said it. The scar on my collarbone is still pink, but it doesn't hurt when I touch it anymore. That's not nothing. If you are watching this, and you are someone whose family has made you feel that loving them means accepting whatever they choose to do to you, I want you to know that is not love. I want you to know that boundaries are not cruelty. I want you to know that the hardest thing I ever did was not walking into that courtroom. The hardest thing I ever did was sitting at my kitchen table and saying, quietly and carefully, to the person I loved most in the world, "What you did has a name, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. You deserve to say that too, if you need to. Whatever happens after, and I won't lie to you, some of it will be hard. You deserve to have said it. Thank you for being here with me today. If this story reached you in some way, please leave me a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needed to hear this, share it with them. I'll see you next time.